don't think I'm difficult to please. Give me pretty period costumes, a girl with a sword, and a heavy dose of anti-monarchy energy, and I will be seated to watch.
Death to the enemies of the people of the Republic. Hurrah! Justice is served.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I like to talk about entertainment media. Today's video is a review of the new Netflix film Damsel, starring Millie Bobby Brown. Before I start giving you my feedback that's more specific than me just saying I liked it, go watch it, I want to give my regular viewers some extra context because if you watch me regularly, you might have been expecting other videos to be uploaded and instead you got this. I was in the middle of editing a new video essay about Anyone But You, and I also pre-filmed a new Bridgerton video over the weekend. And then out of nowhere, I got an email from Netflix saying, "Hey bestie, sorry to get back to you so late, but here's a screener for Damsel that you first emailed us about literally 2 months ago. The embargo lifts in a couple of days. Love you, bye." That's all a direct quote, of course. That's definitely how Hollywood publicists write. Yes, that was sarcasm if you need a tone indicator.
No, you said it. All I have is sarcasm and a gun.
Yeah, that and a right hook.
Now, if I was a truly petty person, I would have just said sod it and not reviewed Damsel because you want me to work overtime when I've got other responsibilities. I'm fostering a rescue cat and her 2 babies. How am I supposed to put together a review in just a couple of weekdays, aka work days, to be ready in time for the embargo to lift? But then I watched the film and I actually really enjoyed it, way more than I thought that I would. So I went, no, I will figure this out. I will let my little corner of the internet know that they need to go watch Damsel on Netflix. But before we get into my feedback, here's a cat cutaway. For today's cat cutaway, you get a little glimpse of Yuki. She's a rescue and these are her 2 babies. I will not be keeping any of them since I already have a cat, but all 3 of them were outside and I couldn't in good conscience leave them out there, so I got them snatched up and brought inside where they can live a cushy life until everyone is old enough to get vaccines, be fixed, and adopted into loving homes. Now, if you didn't already know about Damsel starring Millie Bobby Brown, here's a quick synopsis. A dutiful damsel agrees to marry a handsome prince, only to find the royal family has recruited her as a sacrifice to repay an ancient debt. Thrown into a cave with a fire-breathing dragon, she must rely on her wits and will to survive. For further context, I did not even watch a trailer for this before I watched it. I first emailed Netflix to get a screener when all I had was an extremely basic logline. I saw that it was in the fantasy genre and that it was starring Millie Bobby Brown, and that seemed like sufficient enough of a reason for me to ask for a screener. Enola Holmes 2 was quite good, so I didn't really need to know much else. I was prepared to review it if they would give me a screener, and I almost didn't get one, but we got there in the end. The first thing I want to talk about are the technical aspects. In addition to Millie Bobby Brown's name being attached, something else that caught my eye earlier on was the fact that Larry Fong was credited as the film's cinematographer. I am very familiar with Larry Fong's work. He has done cinematography for multiple Zack Snyder films, and without belaboring the point, I will simply say that the quality of the cinematography is noticeably different on that filmmaker's work when you don't have Larry Fong attached. He's a very skilled cinematographer, and he did not disappoint me one bit with his work on Damsel. He's been delivering iconic visuals for decades. I don't think you can mess him about the way you might try to mess someone about if they were less experienced or established in the industry. As an example of his work, there's a quote from him in the press packet about having to light the caves that Millie Bobby Brown's character Elodie gets trapped in. As for the task of lighting the caves, cinematographer Larry Fong had to get creative. It's tricky because caves are tight, small, and there's usually no source of sunlight, so you have to do what you call movie dark, which is just enough light to see. And in our case, that light has to come from places that maybe don't make any sense in reality. We lit torches when we could, put embers into a pomander, and of course, we had bioluminescent worms. In general, there was such an incredible level of quality to so many of the visual aspects of Damsel as a film when you take into consideration the fact that this is a Netflix original film. Netflix originals are notoriously cheap looking. They underfund so many of their originals, but there was a lot more good than bad with the overall look of Damsel. The only significant thing I didn't like visually in Damsel was that there were a couple of dodgy VFX things. There were a couple of transition shots that were just supposed to be showing the land, the kingdom, also a couple of shots involving dragons Dragonfire, where I found the VFX to be extremely clockable. That being said, the dragon itself looked very good the majority of the time, so I have a feeling that a lot more of the VFX budget and the labor went towards rendering the dragon, which is understandable considering how significant a presence the dragon has in the film's narrative. Another name I recognized in the Damsel credits was production designer Patrick Tatopoulos. In a strange coincidence, Patrick is also a frequent collaborator with Zack Snyder, and he did phenomenal work in those films. He is also someone with decades of experience working on films, and to be clear, his work is not just about production design. What he does in his career, as well as Damsel specifically, is very multifaceted. It's production design, it's special effects, it's creature design. Patrick was the one who designed the dragon that Millie has to face off against. If you don't make the dragon effectively threatening, you're not really going to buy into the drama and tension of the story. It wouldn't make a difference if Millie is acting her face off. If the dragon doesn't look right, that's all you're going to be thinking about when those two characters are interacting. But to really get into some of these specifics involving Patrick's work, and also my thoughts about the overall look of Damsel, we have to follow the trajectory of the story. First, we start in this kingdom where Millie Bobby Brown's character Elodie goes to get married, and you see this gorgeous castle and this lush exterior of the land. I cannot emphasize enough how much better this film looks because they actually got up and went outside to film. They went to Portugal to film exterior shots and to film at a castle or castles. I don't know if they filmed at more than one. Maybe you just use the budget to rent one castle since doing more would be excessive. But did anybody else know that Portugal has over 100 castles? That's wild. Maybe if you were from Portugal, you would already know that, but I never would have assumed the number to be over 100. Literally why? That's so many. But anyway, the castle and the grounds of Oria were modeled after Manuelan architecture, a sumptuous post-Gothic style unique to Portugal that isn't often used in big-budget studio films. The main palace was inspired by the many beautiful castles of Sintra, and the exterior shots were filmed largely on location in Portugal as well. The goal was simple when it came to deciding on Portugal and Manuelan architecture. The kingdom of Oria had to look spectacularly welcoming. It's less dark than what we're used to seeing. It's warmer and more flamboyant than the gloomy castles that are typically used for fantasy stories with dragons. And that was the trick. Oria needed to be a very pleasant place to be on the outside, says Tatopoulos. And when you watch the film and put that in context of the story, it's such a genius choice as a production designer. It makes for a huge contrast when paired up with the dark and scary caves that Elodie ends up in. When I think about a lot of other sword and stone, castle and dragon types of films or series, the aesthetic that often comes to mind can lean towards being a bit more gray, gloomy, overcast, gray clouds. It just creates a very particular mood. But you film in Portugal, you're significantly further south, you're closer to the equator, it's bright and sunny outside, you've got this lush green on the land, and yes, the architecture of the castle Elodie goes to, it just has a different vibe to what you see in a lot of other fantasy stories in Hollywood projects. But then we get into the look of the caves, and when I read up on what Patrick did to help these caves get built, my brain exploded. When it came to creating the cave system, the idea was to have it be an organic extension of the dragon herself, a place she knew intimately and could navigate with ease. Tatopoulos started by translating what was in Dan Mazeau's script pages onto a 15-foot-long physical map of the entire cave system. It was massive. It suddenly gave everybody a chance to understand Elodie's physical journey through this purgatory of sorts. The sets, which were all practically built and later augmented with VFX, were constructed in a way that, if they were laid out next to each other end to end, it would feel as though you were actually going through a maze yourself. A feature that made the 2-month-long shoot inside the caves as physically and mentally demanding for Millie Bobby Brown as it looks. Two things. Number one, a 15-foot map? Are you serious? Whatever Patrick's salary was on this, you need to give him a raise. That is wild, but I love the attention to detail. Details make all the difference. And number two, they built the sets practically. Now, I am not someone who is anti-VFX. I'm a James Cameron's Avatar stan. But there is an overabundance of underfunded, rushed VFX that businessmen push for to cut costs instead of paying qualified workers who are members of unions to do things like build sets. Sets that give the the actor something tangible to touch and interact with, something that they can see that will evoke a certain emotion and vibe that helps them with getting into the headspace of their character. These caves are so ominous and creepy, but all things considered, there's so much dimension and texture to her being in those caves. It doesn't look nearly as much like gray sludge as a lot of films that have shoddy VFX making everything look like that. I'm looking at you, superhero movies, by the way. Those movies will have the characters be in a location that is seemingly supposed to have an abundance of color, and it looks terrible. But then you have this movie, Damsel, where Millie Bobby Brown is running around scared in a cave, and it feels so much more dynamic and engaging to watch because of the quality of work done across the board. Cinematography, production design, all of these things were on point. Now, I know I've gone really into detail about these things, so I'll try to be a bit more quick about a couple of other technical aspects before I jump into my last few sections of this review. I love the costumes. They're very pretty to look at, but there's also a really clever thing done with Elodie's costume where she starts off in these gorgeous, albeit cumbersome period wear. The big dresses with a bunch of layers, but once she's trapped in the cave, more and more of her dress starts to get ripped apart because she needs those pieces of the dress for functional purposes. If she has a wound, all that excess fabric sure comes in handy to wrap up the wound. Costume designer Amanda Monk also did work on Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, so clearly she and her team know a thing or two about the logistics of crafting costumes of a certain fantastical period aesthetic. And Amanda collaborated closely with the Damsel director, Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, on the importance of creating Millie Bobby Brown's main dress. Juan Carlos and I started talking about how the dress could play more of a role within the film, how it starts as a hindrance and something she seems like she's been captured in, like a cage. Then, as the film progresses, it actually becomes a tool to aid her, a Swiss Army knife she could use to get herself out of any given situation. According to Fresnadillo, the dress is almost like a character in the story itself. It's Elodie's real companion in these caves. It's also a metaphor of growing up. She had to literally shed these layers to embrace the woman she is at the end. That dress undergoes 17 stages of deconstruction before it gets to the final warrior princess look. That's the one you've probably seen in certain promotional images for Damsel. One of the other things I love about the world building for the film is that the score sounds so classic and traditional. Instead of trying to do some sort of anachronistic concept that panders to 21st century music trends or pushing to be experimental for the sake of it, the score sounds like something you would hear in a real fantasy epic that you saw decades ago at the cinema, and it's now a film that has become a beloved classic. Composer David Fleming said, "For a film that subverts expectations, the score was actually more traditional. Juan Carlos wanted something timeless and more suited to this world rather than trying to do what has become commonplace nowadays of subverting it." Fleming created strong themes and motifs for each of the characters and passages by using a London-based orchestra and choir. The fact that you finish this film and you can see in the credits a long list of actual human musicians who played their instruments for this film's score, it makes all the difference. Call me old-fashioned if you want about this, but I don't care for the modern tendency to just use samples for everything. I think studios need to stop being so cheap and fund orchestras a whole lot more than they usually do nowadays. Why do you think these iconic scores that everyone knows have stayed in the cultural zeitgeist to the degree that they have? Real musicians playing real instruments, real humans singing in choirs. Duel of the Fates will always be that girl, and no one can take that away from her.
So now, if you'll excuse me, they're playing my jam.
But if you've made it this far, listening to me go on and on about technical things, thank you. Now let's talk about the genre and story. I love a good fantasy epic. I really do. King Arthur Legend of the Sword deserved all its planned sequels, and everyone that prevented that from happening, you are my nemesis. What's especially interesting about Damsel, though, is how it subverts from a lot of what I've come to expect from the genre. I don't see this word being thrown around the press material I was sent from Netflix, but I actually think there is an element of horror to Damsel. When she gets in this cave and she's just trying to figure out how to survive, how to not get roasted by a dragon, the tension and fear are palpable. I don't think Damsel is horror to horror fans, but to a younger audience less accustomed to the genre or its conventions, I would imagine that Damsel would be very effective as horror fiction. There's the external threat of the physical danger of being trapped in a cave, being hunted by a dragon, but there's also a significant amount of emotional turmoil, the betrayals that have led up to Elodie ending up in this cave and processing the aftermath of that, of her really unpacking how and why she's ended up there. If we think about the horror genre, the trapped in a cave with a monster concept is not new, not even close. But when you reframe your references to YA fantasy, this feels like a fresh, darker take on story conventions and tropes. It's emotionally and psychologically probing in a heavier way than I would have expected to see for something that I wasn't expecting to mine those types of layers. No pun intended. Caves, mining. I'll see myself out. It's also not focusing on a love story. She's trapped in that cave with no other humans. She's there, the dragon's there. Now, how is she going to find her way out? It's going to require Elodie to explore the cave, try not to get eaten. Where are you? What are your supplies? Is there anything in the cave you can use to help you? How do you even see what you're doing when you can't be too visible, or else you're going to make it a lot easier for the dragon to track you down? Considering that this is an early review made to publish before the film's release, I can't say what the ending is, but I will at least say that I didn't know what the ending was going to be when the film first started. It took me a while before I could figure out what the story was going to do. The trajectory wasn't immediately obvious from the start. I could theorize, sure, but it did keep me wondering in some ways what they would do until a significant portion of the runtime had passed, and then I could figure things out. And there's a time and place to watch things where you know what the ending is going to be, but it doesn't matter because you're just there for the vibes, or if it's an adaptation of a popular work of fiction that you've already read the source material for. But in this case, it was just a really fun ride to experience a genre and its aesthetics that are beloved and familiar: sword, castle, dragon, and all that jazz. But to have so many subversive, fresh elements also present in the story. The next element is the characters and the performances. This part I can be fairly quick because I don't want to reveal too much, and also because most of the film is just Millie Bobby Brown, because she's the one in the cave with no one else there but the dragon. Now, if you've seen Millie Bobby Brown acting in other things like the Enola Holmes films, you know that she can act perfectly well. I didn't expect to have any issues with her performance, and she delivered what I needed to see from a film like this. The fear, the anguish, the determination Elodie experiences when dealing with the physical and emotional difficulties of this experience, of being trapped in the cave with a dragon. She did everything exactly the way that she should. I have no complaints. Elodie was a great protagonist to follow. She didn't feel overly strong or capable in a way where you didn't actually worry for her safety, but she was also a badass who was fighting like hell to survive in the cave with a dragon. It was a good balance between the two. Now, the dragon is voiced by Shohreh Aghdashloo, and she does a great job with that. There's a lot of dimension to her performance. It's not just a cameo. The dragon is very much a character, and I read in the press packet that the movements of the dragon were not modeled after reptiles, but were actually modeled after cats, and that makes so much sense for the dragon character. She's a lot more cunning and agile, and the voice performance is really good at communicating that vibe. We briefly meet other characters, which I don't want to say too much about because that would probably involve spoilers, so I will instead just briefly touch on two of them. Elodie's stepmother, Lady Bayford, is played by Angela Bassett, and what a pleasant surprise that was. I had no idea that Angela Bassett was in this until I watched my screener, but you know Angela Bassett always delivers. That's Angela Bassett. I also just really liked her character. She was a very subversive take on the stepmother trope. Typically when you see a film with this setting in this time period, it's always the evil stepmother, right? I suppose it's a mild spoiler to say this, but that's not what Angela Bassett is playing. She gets to play a wonderfully nuanced character. Angela has a really powerful presence on camera. She just commands my attention every time I see her. And with this role, you do get that, but there's also this wonderfully earnest emotionality to her. Her character conflict, the dilemma she grapples with. She's not in the film as much as I might have personally liked to see her, but that's not necessarily a knock on the film. That's just my bias of enjoying her as an actress. It makes sense to the narrative that a large amount of the runtime is Millie in the cave. If she can just quickly get out of the cave, that would undermine the threat and tension of the story. I'm just saying. It's Angela Bassett, so of course I would always enjoy seeing more of her doing what she does best. The other standout performance is, of course, Robin Wright. Yup. Princess Buttercup is back in an old fantasy project, but this time she's the evil queen, and oh boy is she evil in so many ways. Her being a monarch was enough reason already for me to root for her downfall, but she gave me all the reasons to want nothing but the worst for her. She was a villain in every sense of the word, and it was a fun contrast to see for Robin Wright specifically, considering how well she's known in this type of genre, but as the heroine, and now she's playing the villain. Finally, I just want to close off the review by really commending the film for its themes, the overall arc of the story, and the journey for Elodie specifically. Anti-monarchy energy will always win me over, and I'm definitely significantly more interested now to see these new Millie Bobby Brown produced projects, because Enola Holmes 2 was a pro-labor union movie, and now we've got an anti-monarchy movie. Now, one time that could have been a fluke, but now it's 2 times, so maybe we've got some real momentum going for some very compelling female-led fiction for me to watch and enjoy. The story also has a really compelling arc that isn't just about physical strength, survivalism, learning how to use a sword. There's an important exploration of empathy, compassion, morality, humanity, and I would also argue encouraging a reverence and respect for nature. This is a bit of a mild spoiler, but I really like the way Elodie interacts with the bioluminescent worms. You think of worms, you think bugs, and bugs being scary, but for Elodie, she actually takes great care to not be needlessly violent or cruel to these bugs. She even talks to them a little bit, which admittedly that could just be the film making sure that the audience receives the information we need to receive. And when Elodie is alone in the cave, she can't exactly have information revealed by her speaking to other characters. It's just her and the dragon, the same dragon that's trying to barbecue her. So that doesn't exactly leave much room for conversations between the two of them. So yeah, you can have Elodie talk to some bugs, and I love what that reveals about who she is as a person and the themes that have been interwoven into the story. Whenever there's a new Millie Bobby Brown film that she's producing and starring in for Netflix, I more or less assume that there will be a lot of young people, children, teens, young adults tuning in to watch, and I love the idea that they can watch a film that inspires empowerment, empathy, but also finding the will and the courage to dig deep, to bring forth inner strength to fight back against evil power structures. Just because something is run a certain way doesn't mean that that's the right way, and if injustice is afoot, use your brain, make a plan, get your sword, and fight back. Those are my thoughts on Damsel. I recommend you watch it if you haven't already. At the time of me publishing this review, the film will be released on Netflix in less than 24 hours, so maybe it's already out by the time that you've gotten around to watching this review. Like, comment, subscribe to support my small channel, help it grow, and stick around for more videos about movies and shows that are made for the girls. Bye.